and you can change it whenever you want. So you're a man or a woman, and that's your choice. But we're going to have a new rule, which is that if you have an XY chromosome, so you're an XY person or an XX person, then if you're an XY person, you don't get to engage in physical combat with an XY person.
Yes.
Men or
with
women.
An XX person.
Doesn't matter.
Yes.
Yeah. How would that...
If you're XY, you can't engage in physical combat with XX.
That's right. XYs cannot hit XXs. How's that? And maybe they can't run in running contests against them, and maybe they can't play tennis against them. No.
You want them to be recognized as a woman. You sure? But as soon as you're compelling people, like here's one that's going up lately. If you don't want to date a trans woman, then you are some sort of a bigot. That if you're a man, even if you want a family.
You know, you remember in Brave New World, in Huxley's book, it was considered immoral to reject anyone's sexual advances because it was prejudicial.
Oh, yes.
And the thing is, it is prejudicial. That's the thing. Whereas if you're a female math nerd, you have other options because you're more likely to also be verbally gifted. And so that's enough to, at least in principle, account for some of the reason why there are fewer women mathematicians than men mathematicians.
They have other options.
They have other options. And there's lots of complex reasons like this. And so we have this reflexive idea, and this is very much the case, because this is like the core idea among the feminist neo-Marxist types, is that if there's differences in outcome, that's proof of prejudice, and that's support for the idea of the patriarchal tyranny. And that's like the core axiom of the radical left, is the patriarchal tyranny, as far as I'm concerned. So that's one kind of equality. Open up the playing field so that everybody has a chance to compete and cooperate and land where they will. But then the other kind of equality is equality of outcome, and so the ultimate equity utopia would be take every job, every conceivable kind of job, and then stratify that by every conceivable level of authority within every job. And then ensure that every single category of person is represented in precise proportion to their prevalence in the population. So every job should be 50% women and 50% men, and say 13% non-Western ethnic minority, and whatever that happens to be, and then you could break that down. No, the conservative types, the duty types, and I'm not complaining about them, they're always basically saying, well, this is how you should act, because in some sense that's your duty, right? That's how a good citizen would act, and that's a reasonable argument. But the case that I've been making is more that, well, there is value distinctions between things. Some things are worth doing and some things aren't, and you can kind of discover what that is for yourself, and then you should aim at the things that are most worth doing.
Like, this is the ultimate goal, that if you ask people, what would you like out of civilization? Well, I'd like everyone to be happy and everyone to get along, and there to be no war, nothing, no suffering, no anything. But in order to really truly learn about yourself and about life, you have to overcome adversity. You have to experience things.
But the first thing he encounters is a famine, and then he encounters a tyranny, and then he encounters a bunch of people in the tyrannical state that want to take his wife. And so you can imagine that Abraham's response to that is like, it was a hell of a lot better sitting in my dad's tent playing video games. We need all of that. It's like, why isn't it 50% women? And so I've said things like, well, 80% of the people who watch YouTube videos are men, and so the fact that 80% of the people who watch my videos are men isn't that surprising given that base rate. But then about 3 weeks ago I started thinking, what the hell am I doing? It's like, what, is there something wrong with talking to men? Is that actually a problem? It's like I didn't set out to do that specifically, but if that's the way it's working out, and there is a majority of men coming to my shows, say, then why is that all of a sudden supposed to be a bad thing? I'm asking men to be more honest, and especially in their speech and their thinking, and to be more responsible for themselves and for their family and for their community, and to grow up and to shoulder their burden and to live a responsible and meaningful life, and putting those two things together conceptually. Yeah, well, maybe, see, the other thing that I've been thinking along the same lines is that, it isn't, so in the biblical stories, in Abrahamic stories, for example, Abraham basically hangs around his dad's tent till he's like 80.
And to really appreciate camaraderie, you have to feel loneliness. So this is just a part of being a person, for whatever reason.
He's one of these guys that fails to launch, in a big way. And God eventually gets sick and tired of him, like, playing video games in his basement and says, get the hell out there into the world and have a life. And so he does. He leaves his father's tent, his community and his country, which is what he's commanded to do. And then he goes out and has an adventure. Imagine that. We already know from a clinical perspective that, if you set out a path towards a goal, which you want to do because you need a goal and you need a path, because that provides you with positive emotion, right? So you set up something as valuable, so that implies a hierarchy. You set up something as valuable. You decide that you're going to do that instead of other things, so that's kind of a sacrifice, because you're sacrificing everything else to pursue that. And then you experience a fair bit of positive emotion and meaning as you watch yourself move towards the goal. And so the implication of that is that the better the goal, the more full and rich your experience is going to be when you pursue it. And then we could assume that people would like solutions to those problems. So we could agree on that. Then we could say, well, then if you implement a solution socially, so with other people, then you're going to cooperate and compete in relationship to the solution.
Right. The people who solve those problems get financial incentive to solve those problems.
Yes, and they do that because the rest of us are greedy and desperate. It's like, we want the people who are good at solving the problems to keep solving them. And so what we're trying to do is to reward them so that they'll keep doing it even if it's difficult.
Yes.
To give them some status.
Them extraordinarily.
If necessary. That's what it is. It's an ignorant unidimensional analysis. It's put forward by someone who's reflexively opposed to anything that smacks of competition and who isn't thinking it through at all.
They're denying the benefits of competition and the fact that they reap those very benefits of competition by enjoying the products that are created by these corporations.
Yes. Well,
it's very hypocritical.
And well, that's for sure. That's called a performative contradiction. It's like, well, I like to complain about left-wing issues on my iPhone.
Right. Because this is for a guy who's in his 50s, who becomes famous out of nowhere and doesn't just become famous, but becomes this culturally significant sort of lightning rod. I mean, that's how I view you, and a lot of these talks that you're doing, a lot of these debates like you're having with this woman at GQ, or some of your interviews. What you're doing is you're expressing yourself in a brave but very controversial way, and a lot of people are paying attention to this, but then you're backing it up with your research, you're backing it up with real science, knowledge of how to deal with it or what to do, and
too,
wanting to protect your family as well, so not wanting to step out of line.
Absolutely. That's the thing. The problem is that if you're going to forestall that sort of thing, you have to do it early. Because the longer you wait, the higher the price you pay for it.
But it's hard to take that jump early because you're not exactly sure where it's going.
That's true. And you're also likely to be jumped on.
Yes.
I mean, you can see that happening in our own culture. You make a mistake on Twitter, or even something that isn't a mistake, and you can pay what feels to be a pretty high price. Right. Now, whether it is a high price or not is hard to tell because Twitter is so weirdly fictional. It's so hard to get a grasp on exactly what's going on.
Well, it's also your comprehension of what is your emotional reaction to people that you don't know being mean to you.
So that's a big issue. You don't get to have any preferences so it's like, well, how's that not a prejudice? Well, then the question is, under what circumstances are prejudices justifiable? And that's a conversation we don't like to have because we believe that there are no circumstances whatsoever under which prejudices are acceptable.
I think those two get conflated. Yeah, sure.
Everything isn't the same about everything all the time.
It fucks with them. They'll stay up for nights. It's not good. It's you're taking in all of these opinions of hundreds, if not thousands, of people that you don't even know. You don't know if they're coming from a healthy place, and most of those opinions, they would not express it that way if they were talking. Even if they could get the same message across, like, I think you were ignorant to these facts. I think you're biased in your perceptions. Even if they had an opinion that was unflattering, the way they would express it to you, they'd be considerate about you and your feelings as a human being. And if they weren't, you wouldn't take into consideration what they're saying because this guy's just an asshole. I really like that. But there's a lot of it is just people just trying to get a reaction. And what's the reaction they can get? By pissing you off. That's like the best one.
Well, they also might be the ones that are most, like, we don't exactly know what motivates people to respond on Twitter, and it might be that the fundamental motivation for a Twitter response is anger.
Yeah.
Rather than the desire to share something, because we don't know anything about how these new communication techniques function psychologically.
Right.
Like maybe Twitter is skewed 90% towards people who are impulsively angry at that moment. It could easily be. We don't know. Like, if you're driving in your car and someone cuts you off, you curse, or at least I do. And what you'll find if you watch carefully is that the things that you find worth doing are almost always associated with an increase in responsibility. Because if you think about the people you admire, for example, you spontaneously admire people, and that's a manifestation of the instinct to imitate. You don't admire people who don't take care of themselves. And then if they've got something left over so they can be accountable for their family, well, then that's a net plus, obviously. That's someone you think is solid. And then maybe they take care of some more people. They have a business or they're involved in the community in some positive way. You see, well, that's a person whose pattern of being is worth imitating. And that's all associated with responsibility. And maybe there's some utility to that. But with anonymous accounts and all of that, the anonymity is also problematic, because it certainly enables people to allow their worst to manifest themselves, especially if they're resentful and angry. So
the only benefit that I can see to anonymity is it gives you the opportunity to explore controversial ideas without blowing
true.
up.
I think there's some utility. I mean, I don't think that it should be forbidden, but well, like most things, it has its advantages and its disadvantages.
Yeah, like most things. It's not entirely negative to be anonymous.
Hey, so I figured something out that I thought I'd tell you about, because as far as I'm concerned, and I really believe this, is that every single person who sets out to put themselves together ethically is a net positive to everyone around them. There's no downside to that. And my book has been criticized by people who've read it very poorly, especially chapter 1, when I talk about hierarchies, that I'm somehow supporting the idea that power in a hierarchy is the right way to be. And there's absolutely nothing in what I've written that suggests that at all. Like, I'm suggesting that human hierarchies are very complex, and that the way that you win in a human hierarchy is by being competent and reciprocal. And so, I mean, for example, even if you're selfish, let's say, you got to think very carefully about what that would mean if you were selfish and awake, because you have to work to take care of yourself and what you want, say, in this moment. Like, I do believe that small limit facilitates angry, impulsive responding.
Perhaps because you're trying to get people to respond to you, but the alternative is Facebook, where you have these long posts that are just rambling first drafts that people put out. They're like, when they start ranting about politics or what have you, I just can't get involved. They're just too big. And then people jump in and comment on them, and often.
So, if you're a reasonable person, you're very sensitive to criticism,
right,
because it's rare and because you might be wrong, especially if there's a lot of people criticizing you, because you kind of have to be psychopathic in order just to brush that off. It's like, well, 100 people think I'm wrong. There's nothing to that. It's like, well, if it's 100 people out of 100 million, but you can't tell on Twitter,
right,
then it's irrelevant. But if it's a mob of 100 people that show up outside your house, which is quite kind of what Twitter feels like, then you think, well, God, I must have done something wrong, because otherwise why would all these people be here?
Right.
And I think that's why so many people are driven to apologize, when they do something on Twitter or do something, and then the Twitter mobs go after them. They think, oh God, I must have done something wrong. I should do some soul searching. And so some of that's not even fear. It's one of the things. I wrote the foreword for the new version of Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, the abridged version. It came out November 1st. And I was trying to figure out why the Russian Revolution went wrong so rapidly, because it went wrong right from the beginning. And Solzhenitsyn quotes this guy named, I think his name was Walter Latsis, if I remember correctly. I got the Latsis part right anyways. And he said, when you're interrogating a member of the bourgeoisie to decide whether they constitute an enemy of the state, you don't give any credibility to such niceties as individual guilt or innocence. All you care about is their group and their background and their economic status. Agreeable people are maternal, and disagreeable people are competitive, and there's a fair bit of male-female difference there. Conscientious people are dutiful and industrious and orderly, and the open people are creative. And so those are your basic 5 dimensions. Okay, so that's been established, and everyone more or less agrees on it. Now, maybe there's 7 dimensions, and we've got a questionnaire that breaks the 5 down into 10. That's called understand myself. But basically, there's good consensus on the 5. Okay, so now, as soon as you have the 5 basic traits, you can ask some questions like, well, do men and women differ? And so what you do is you just give the questionnaire. You can either fill it out yourself or have other people fill it out on your behalf. So, and it could be a teacher, it could be a parent, and that's all been done. And so that's the greater male variability hypothesis. There's been papers putting that forward that have been retracted as a consequence of pressure from politically correct people, even though greater male variability is actually quite common in the animal kingdom for a variety of reasons. Men are more expendable, that males are more expendable in some ways, or you could say that males are more likely to pursue high-risk, high-return strategies. You can look at it either way, and it's certainly possible. In any case, the males in junior high who happen to be mathematically gifted are less likely to also be verbally gifted, whereas that doesn't seem to be the case for the females. And so if you're a male math nerd, then math is a pretty logical pathway for you because you don't have as many other options. It just dissolves in your hands.
Yes, that's what I'm saying, is that if you're entering into a job straight out of college, you leave university and now you're entering into, your first year in the workplace, it's just a natural fact of life that there's going to be people that are further ahead in this race than you.
Because they're better at what they do.
They're
some of them
better at it,
because
they have more experience,
and
they have
some
more
it might be
education.
some of them are more crooked and sneaky too.
That's possible as well.
Because
but it's the agreeing, everyone agreeing that this is a game.
But you don't know to begin with how an interview is going to go, and I could just say, well, I'm done having interviews for a while, but I can't help but see that the conflict is a necessary part of this, even though I don't find it pleasant. Like people think, they accuse me of being a provocateur, of enjoying the conflict. And it's actually not true at all. I don't enjoy it at all. It usually takes me about 3 days to recover from a particularly contentious interview. Because I find conflict, interpersonal conflict, quite stressful.
Yes.
But I think
everyone does.
Yes.
And to pretend you don't, you're either a sociopath or you're a liar.
Yes. Well, there are people who seem to enjoy that kind of intellectual combat. That they and the political types are more like that.
It makes sense now that I'm thinking about it. Of course they are.
There's one thing that's quite peculiar about the United States in that regard. It's like most working class people, let's say, are far more irritated with the intellectual elite than they are with the wealthy elite. And that's because they think they could become wealthy, and they could, but they don't think they could become part of the intellectual elite. And it isn't obvious to me that the intellectual elite, so those would be the liberal left-leaning types that dominate the media and academia, are particularly positive in their attitudes towards the typical working class person. I think they're prejudiced and elitist. I do believe that that's the case. But if that's the way it's working out, and there is a majority of men coming to my shows, say, then why is that all of a sudden supposed to be a bad thing? I am absolutely thrilled. Like every time someone comes up to me, and that's happening maybe 100 times a week or something like that, and tells me one of these stories about how they put their life together, it's like, I'm absolutely thrilled about that.
Her arguments made more sense.
Yeah.
She seemed more reasonable, more well-read.
Yeah.
She was able to think on her feet quicker. But still, these are really important conversations.
Well, it was a funny day because I went to the hotel room in Baltimore, and I went out of my way to do it. And she was hostile to me the second I walked into the room.
Really?
Yes, and that really kind of put me off. You're lucky if you get some things that are good at once, So we're very grateful to have that opportunity, and that I was going to continue to do this as long as I was thrilled to be in front of the audience, and then when I meet people afterwards, that I'm not looking at the end of the line to see when the night ends, because I want to be sure that every single person that comes to meet me, I'm present for. Absolutely, because I am actually quite taken aback and thrilled, I guess is the right word. Grateful. That's better.
Yes.
That they're there. That's God for them. The patriarchal tyranny. It's not scalable. But if you're like a software designer, it's infinitely scalable. And so there's a much wider range of possibility for generating much larger income pools and much larger pools of wealth If you have a job, you want to be the guy or the woman who's working that extra 10% because the return on that is non-linear. So that's a really useful thing to know. Men are more likely to work outside. They're more likely to work in dangerous businesses. They're more likely to run full-time businesses rather than part-time businesses. So that's the re-representation of that positive ancestral father. So that's why you rescue your father from the belly of the beast.
So you think that this ultimate goal of sacrifice and of risking your life in order to save someone who's truly important to you, that this somehow or another maximizes your potential as a human being?
Well, I think you can think about it religiously too. So you think about it this way. So in the Christian story, for example, you have Christ does two things that are messianic. One is takes the suffering of the world onto himself. Okay, so that's a weird idea. Okay, so what does that mean? Let's think about it psychologically. Well, maybe it means that, well, that's your job. Is the world's full of suffering, and you should accept that as your responsibility, past, present, and future. If you could look at the harshest things, like the most brutal parts of the suffering of the world and the malevolence of people and society, if you could look at that straight and directly, that would turn you on maximally. And so that's the idea of rescuing your father, because imagine that you're like the potential composite of all the ancestral wisdom that's locked inside of you biologically. But that's not going to come out at all unless you stress yourself, unless you challenge yourself. And the bigger the challenge you take on, the more that's going to turn on. And so that as you take on a broader and broader range of challenges and you push yourself harder, then more and more of what you could be turns on, and that's equivalent to transforming yourself into the ancestral father. And here's why. So imagine you do something new, and that's informative, right? There's information in the action, and then you can incorporate that information and turn it into a skill and turn it into a transformation of your perceptions. So there's more to you because you've tried something new. So that's one thing. It's like a truism. It's been known for 30 years. So
we can definitely get back to that. But I'm very curious about this, because this idea of enforced equality, right? Ensuring that there is such a high emphasis placed on equality, that you have the equal amount of men, the equal amount of women, and the opportunities are absolutely available as much to women as they are to men. This is enforced. That this creates an environment where there's less resistance. Now, in an environment where there's less resistance, perhaps women don't feel as compelled to say, I'll show you. And that these are corrective paths and patterns that can lead you to a more fulfilled and happier life. And recognize the pitfalls of certain types of behavior that people just fall into. And I think oftentimes the difference between someone who lives a fulfilled life and someone who lives a life filled with disaster is following incorrect patterns and not knowing what the correct ones are. They do it because they've been influenced by certain patterns. They've fallen into patterns, whether it's because of the people that they surround themselves with, or the neighborhood they grew up, the people that are around them have this way of being, and they kind of fall into that, or it's drugs, or it's alcohol, or whatever it is. But then they find a new one. And then they can slide right into that new one, and all of a sudden they feel energized when they wake up in the morning instead of hungover. They're getting exercise in, they're eating healthy, they're starting to think about things correctly and do good things. So that's one of the reasons for developing a vision and for fleshing yourself out philosophically, because you want to aim at the highest goal that you can manage. And then what you'll find is that as you move towards the goal, there are certain things that you have to accomplish that frighten you. You have to be better to people around you, or you have to learn some new skills and you're afraid of that, whatever, because it's going to stretch you if you pursue a goal. Okay, so all the clinical data indicates, well, the opposite of safe spaces, as Jonathan Haidt has been pointing out, that what you want to do when you identify something that someone is avoiding that they need to do because they're afraid, you have them voluntarily confronted. If you're talking about my field of business, you're talking about combat sports. I mean, I had Miriam Nakamoto on yesterday. She's a monster. She's
a tough woman can beat a variety of men. Yes.
You know, and people don't like to hear these things, and they want to pretend that you can even out the playing field with hormones. There's not a single woman that's going to be able to deal with that bone structure and that mind that guy has had with testosterone pumping through it for 39 years.
Preposterous that we even have to have the discussion.
You want him to be recognized as a woman.